Judge Lucas woke up to the soft hum of the city outside his apartment window. It was just another ordinary morning in the small town where he had spent most of his life. He had lived here all his life, grown up playing in its parks, attending its schools, and eventually becoming a respected figure in the legal system. People trusted him not just because of his title, but because he had always been fair and steady, someone who listened before making decisions. On the surface, it looked like a regular day. Lucas dressed in his usual crisp suit, carefully tying his tie, and headed to the courthouse. The courthouse itself was quiet that morning, with only the faint sound of paper shuffling and the echo of footsteps on marble floors. Lucas walked through the familiar halls, greeting staff and clerks, exchanging polite smiles and nods. He had seen countless trials and had presided over many cases before, but nothing in recent memory made his chest tighten the way it would later that day. He thought about the day's docket, a few civil cases, a minor traffic hearing, and nothing that seemed unusual. At least that was until he entered courtroom 3. When Lucas stepped in, he froze for just a moment, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing softly in his mind. At the defense table sat a young woman, calm yet composed, her eyes looking slightly tired but determined. Lucas blinked and did a double take. The face in front of him was familiar, impossibly familiar. For a moment he felt his heart skip a beat. He couldn't believe it. It was Maya. Maya had been his closest friend in childhood. They had spent countless hours running through the fields behind their old school, playing games that only children could imagine, sharing secrets that no one else knew. She had been bold, clever, and fearless, always ready to defend anyone who needed help. Lucas remembered the times they had gotten into trouble together, laughed at silly pranks, and stayed up late sharing dreams of what life might bring them. And now, here she was, sitting across the courtroom, facing serious charges that could change her life forever. The judge took his seat, trying to steady himself. He reminded himself that he had a duty to remain impartial, that the law demanded fairness above all else. Yet he could not ignore the flood of memories rushing through him. Seeing Maya again after so many years was like a sudden gust of wind from the past. He had not seen her since she had moved away as a teenager, her family leaving town for reasons he barely understood at the time. He had thought of her occasionally, wondering where life had taken her, but never imagining they would meet under these circumstances. Maya's case was serious. She was accused of embezzling a large sum of money from a local charity that supported underprivileged children. The evidence presented by the prosecution was compelling, and the tension in the room was almost tangible. People whispered among themselves, glancing at the judge and the defendant, trying to imagine how the respected Judge Lucas would handle this delicate situation. Lucas knew that the stakes were high, not just for Maya, but for the reputation of the court and for justice itself. As the trial began, Lucas found it difficult to focus solely on the proceedings. Every time Maya spoke, he remembered the young girl she had been, her laughter, her quick smile, the way she had encouraged him to try harder, to believe in himself. He recalled the summer afternoons they had spent sitting under the large oak tree in the park, drawing imaginary maps and making promises to always be there for each other. All of that seemed like another life now, almost impossible to connect with the reality of the courtroom. Yet, he reminded himself that he had a job to do. The law did not bend for friendship or memories. He listened carefully as the lawyers began presenting their cases. The prosecution painted a picture of deception and greed, suggesting that Maya had intentionally misused funds for personal gain. Witnesses testified, each statement adding weight to the accusation. Some of the claims were detailed, technical, and difficult to follow, but the underlying message was clear. The charity had lost a significant amount of money, and Maya, as an accountant, had been responsible. Despite the mounting evidence, Lucas noticed subtle things in Maya's demeanor. She did not appear arrogant or dismissive. There was no trace of the self-interest the prosecution implied. Instead, she seemed nervous, but honest, as if she carried a burden that was heavier than the courtroom walls could contain. The way she fidgeted with her hands, the slight trembling in her voice, and the brief glances at the judge all suggested someone who knew the truth and wanted it to be understood. Lucas felt a flicker of hope mixed with his worry. Could it be that the story presented by the prosecution was not the whole truth? The gallery was full of curious townspeople. Some had known Maya in her youth. Others only knew her as the defendant in a serious case. Whispers filled the air, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of papers. Lucas could feel the weight of the room, the silent judgment of the audience, and the expectations resting on his shoulders. He was aware that his decisions would be scrutinized, that any hint of bias could be damaging. He had to find a way to remain fair, while also holding on to the instinctive knowledge of the person sitting across from him, someone he had once trusted and believed in completely. The trial continued with careful examination of the documents. The lawyers went through spreadsheets, invoices, and emails, pointing out discrepancies and highlighting suspicious transactions. Lucas followed each piece of evidence meticulously, ensuring he understood the details, no matter how tedious or complex. But even as he focused on the numbers, he could not stop his mind from drifting back to their shared past. He remembered the time Maya had stood up to a bully who had been picking on a younger student, or how she had convinced him to apologize when he had done something wrong, even when he was stubbornly resisting. Those moments reminded him of her integrity, of the strong moral compass that had guided her since childhood. Lunch break finally came, and the courtroom emptied out, leaving only a few staff members behind. Lucas stayed seated, staring at the empty gallery, reflecting on the situation. He realized that he faced not just a legal challenge, but an emotional one. He had to separate the child he had known from the adult facing trial. But could he truly do that without understanding what had led her here? He decided he needed to dig deeper, to examine not only the surface evidence but also the circumstances surrounding the case. He owed that to justice and to the truth he believed Maya deserved. As the first day of the trial ended, Lucas watched Maya leave the courtroom. Her expression was calm, almost stoic, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a silent acknowledgement of the storm surrounding her. Lucas felt a mix of sorrow and determination. He knew that the coming days would test him as a judge, as a friend, and as a person who believed in fairness above all. The story was just beginning, and already it had shaken him to his core. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. Lucas stepped out for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to center himself. He thought about the childhood they had shared, the laughter, the secrets, the promises made under the oak tree. Those memories were precious, but they were also fragile in the face of reality. Yet he knew that no matter what the law demanded, he had to uncover the truth. For Maya, for justice, and for the bond that had survived the years, he would face the challenge head-on. The first day had ended, but the questions remained. How had Maya ended up here? Was she truly guilty, or had she been caught in circumstances beyond her control? Could he remain impartial while knowing what he knew about her character? Lucas walked home slowly, the courthouse fading behind him, but the weight of the day pressing forward. He knew that tomorrow, the real work would begin, and that the story of his childhood friend in the courtroom would continue to unfold in ways he could not yet imagine. The next morning, Judge Lucas arrived at the courthouse feeling a strange mix of anticipation and unease. He had spent the night replaying the previous day's events in his mind, trying to make sense of the shock he had felt upon seeing Maya. The memories of their childhood together were vivid and persistent. He remembered the small adventures they had gone on, the games they had played in the streets, and the long talks under the old oak tree at the park. Those days had been full of innocence and laughter, yet now the girl he had known seemed like someone from another life, someone sitting across the courtroom facing serious charges that could ruin her life. Lucas had prepared himself for the trial, to continue, but he knew that remaining completely impartial would be more challenging than ever. He had to separate the child he had known from the adult in front of him, but that was easier said than done. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitant word from Maya reminded him of the person she had once been. She had always been honest and strong, someone who cared deeply about others and stood up for what was right. And yet, here she was, accused of a crime that seemed so out of character. As the courtroom filled with people, Lucas noticed familiar faces in the gallery, Townspeople who had known Maya when she was younger, neighbors, and even some who had worked with her in recent years. There were whispers as people tried to guess how the judge would handle this case, and everyone seemed to sense the tension in the room. Lucas took a deep breath and reminded himself that he could not let the past cloud his judgment. The law required him to focus on the facts, to listen carefully, and to ensure that justice was served. The prosecution resumed its case, presenting more evidence and calling witnesses who claimed to have seen irregularities in the charity's finances. Lucas listened attentively, asking questions when needed to clarify the details. The numbers were complicated, the transactions seemed suspicious, and at first glance the case against Maya appeared strong. But Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The more he studied the documents and listened to the testimonies, the more he began to notice gaps, inconsistencies, and small details that had been overlooked. Meanwhile, Maya remained composed, though a subtle tension lingered in her movements. She answered questions carefully, never raising her voice or showing anger even when the accusations seemed unfair. Lucas could see the weight she carried, the quiet dignity that refused to crumble even under pressure. It reminded him of the brave, determined girl he had known. He wondered how she had managed to stay so calm and strong in the face of such public scrutiny. Her composure was remarkable, and it made him feel a renewed sense of responsibility to uncover the truth. During a break in the trial, Lucas stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to think. The courthouse was quieter now, and he leaned against the wall, trying to gather his thoughts. He thought about how much time had passed since their childhood, how people change, and yet how some qualities remain constant. Maya's courage, honesty, and resilience were evident even now, and Lucas realized that these traits could not be ignored when judging her character. He resolved that he would examine the case thoroughly, not just relying on what appeared on the surface, but seeking to understand the circumstances that had led to this moment. As the trial continued, Lucas paid close attention to the witnesses called by the defense. Some were former colleagues of Maya who spoke of her integrity, her dedication to her work, and her willingness to help others even when it was inconvenient. Others were members of the community who attested to her kind nature and reliability. Each testimony painted a picture of someone very different from the image the prosecution had presented. Lucas began to feel that perhaps Maya had been caught in a situation beyond her control, manipulated or misled by someone else, and that her innocence might be revealed if the truth could be fully uncovered. Lucas also noticed the subtle ways Maya interacted with her lawyer, the quiet nods and the careful way she responded to advice. It showed a level of maturity and thoughtfulness that reminded him of the girl who had once guided him when he struggled with his own decisions. He realized that her past actions and character could not be ignored when considering the present situation. She had always been someone who valued honesty and fairness, and Lucas trusted that this was still true of her. As the day wore on, Lucas began requesting additional information from both sides. He asked for detailed financial records, emails, and correspondence related to the charity's operations. The more he looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Some transactions seemed to have been manipulated or misreported, and certain key figures who could clarify the situation were surprisingly absent. Lucas felt a mix of frustration and determination. It was clear that the surface-level accusations were not telling the whole story, and he became even more committed to finding out what had really happened. During a brief recess, Lucas watched as Maya quietly spoke with a few supporters in the gallery. He noticed the way she thanked them politely, her humility and grace evident even in such a tense environment. It struck him that despite everything, she had not lost her sense of self. She had remained the same person at her core, someone who cared for others and approached life with sincerity. Lucas felt a renewed determination to uncover the truth, not just because of their shared past, but because he believed in justice and wanted to ensure that it was served properly. Throughout the day, Lucas also observed the reactions of the public. Some were clearly skeptical, influenced by the prosecution's presentation and the seriousness of the charges. Others seemed sympathetic, perhaps remembering the Maya they had known in the community, or sensing that there was more to the story than what was being presented. Lucas realized that the courtroom was not just a place of law, but also a place of human emotion, perception, and judgment. He had to navigate all of this carefully, balancing the facts with his understanding of human nature and character. As the trial continued into the afternoon, Lucas found moments to reflect on his own life and the choices that had brought him to this position. He remembered the dreams he and Maya had shared as children, the plans they had made for the future, and the values they had promised to uphold. Those memories were bittersweet now, a reminder of innocence lost and the complexities of adult life. Yet they also reminded him of the person Maya had always been, and perhaps still was, the person he believed deserved a fair chance to prove her innocence. By the end of the day, it was clear to Lucas that the case was far more complicated than it had seemed at first. The evidence presented by the prosecution was not the complete story, and the testimony from witnesses provided important context that had been missing. Lucas knew that the coming days would require careful attention, deep investigation, and thoughtful judgment. He also understood that this was not just about legal documents and testimony. It was about a person, someone he had known intimately in childhood, whose life hung in the balance. As the courtroom emptied and the staff began packing up, Lucas stayed behind for a moment, looking at the empty seats where the public had been just hours before. The echoes of the day's proceedings lingered in his mind. He felt a sense of responsibility heavier than he had ever experienced. This case was not just another trial. It was a test of fairness, integrity, and human understanding. He thought about the challenges ahead, the need to dig deeper, and the possibility that the truth could be very different from what everyone assumed. Walking out of the courthouse into the evening air, Lucas felt the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The city streets were calm, but inside him a storm of thoughts and memories swirled. He thought about Maya, her courage, her character, and the journey that had brought her here. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more evidence, and more revelations, but he also knew that he was determined to find the truth, no matter how complicated or difficult the process might be. As he headed home, Lucas allowed himself a moment to remember the past with a small, wistful smile. The games, the laughter, the shared secrets, all of it reminded him that the person in front of him was more than just a defendant. She was someone who had once been a friend, someone whose character he trusted, and someone whose story deserved to be told fully and fairly. The first step had been taken, but the journey to uncover the truth was only beginning. The next day, Judge Lucas arrived at the courthouse with a sense of determination he had not felt in a long time. After the first 2 days of the trial, it had become clear to him that the case against Maya was far more complicated than anyone had realized. Something didn't add up. The prosecution had presented evidence that looked convincing at first glance, but the more he studied it, the more inconsistencies he noticed. He could see that certain financial records didn't match up, and some key witnesses had contradicted themselves. It was beginning to look like Maya had been caught in a larger web that had nothing to do with her own intentions. Lucas sat at the bench, reviewing the documents before the morning session began. He had asked his clerk to gather additional files related to the charity's finances, and he pored over them carefully. There were discrepancies in the accounting, missing signatures on important forms, and transfers that were never properly explained. Something felt off, as though someone had intentionally manipulated the records to make Maya look guilty. Lucas knew he had to dig deeper, but he also had to maintain the appearance of impartiality in the courtroom. He could not let anyone suspect that he had a personal connection to the defendant. When the trial resumed, Lucas requested more detailed information about the financial transactions. Asking for emails, receipts, and communication logs, the defense lawyer presented documents that the prosecution had overlooked, and as Lucas examined them, he noticed a pattern. Many of the questionable transactions were linked to a senior official at the charity, someone who had the authority to move money without immediate oversight. Lucas realized that Maya, as an accountant, had likely been following instructions without realizing she was being used to cover up someone else's wrongdoing. Witnesses were called to clarify these transactions, and slowly a different picture began to emerge. One employee who had initially testified against Maya returned to the stand and admitted that they had been pressured to provide false statements. Another witness revealed that certain financial reports had been altered after being submitted, and that Maya had no knowledge of the changes. Lucas felt a sense of relief mixed with frustration. Relief because it was clear that Maya might be innocent, and frustration because it had taken so much effort to uncover the truth. Throughout the morning, Lucas observed Maya closely. She listened quietly to the proceedings, her expression calm but tense. He noticed small signs of relief in her eyes as the evidence began to shift in her favor. She remained composed, never showing arrogance or anger, even when some witnesses tried to paint her in a negative light. Lucas felt a surge of admiration for her resilience. The girl he had once known, who had always stood up for others, was still the same person at her core, facing a storm she did not deserve. As the day progressed, Lucas decided to take a more active role in clarifying the facts. He asked pointed questions about certain transactions, seeking to understand the timeline and who was responsible for each action. The answers he received painted a story of manipulation and deceit by someone in a higher position, someone who had exploited Maya's role in the organization. Lucas felt a mixture of anger and determination. He knew that the real culprit had to be held accountable, and that Maya deserved a fair chance to clear her name. During a brief recess, Lucas walked down the hallway of the courthouse, reflecting on what he had discovered. The more he learned, the more he understood that the accusations against Maya were not just unfair, they were dangerous. A false conviction could destroy her reputation, her career, and her life. He thought about their shared childhood, about the trust he had in her character, and how that trust now guided his judgment. He realized that sometimes justice required more than following the surface evidence. It required understanding the truth beneath the details. The afternoon session brought more revelations. Emails were introduced that showed Maya had questioned certain instructions she had received, expressing concern about the legality of some actions. These emails had been ignored by her superiors and, in some cases, hidden from investigators. Witnesses testified that Maya had acted in good faith, trying to follow the rules as best she could. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. What had seemed like a clear-cut case of embezzlement was now becoming a story of exploitation, manipulation, and betrayal. Lucas could feel the tension in the room ease slightly as the truth began to surface. The prosecution, once confident and assertive, now seemed unsure, having to respond to evidence that undermined their claims. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding story. Even some of the skeptical townspeople who had assumed Maya was guilty now appeared to reconsider, their expressions softening as they listened to the new testimony. Lucas realized that the courtroom was witnessing a transformation, not just in the evidence but in perception. Despite the progress, Lucas remained vigilant. He knew that the final outcome would depend on careful analysis, and that it was his responsibility to ensure that the law was applied correctly. He continued to ask questions, probe the evidence, and verify the credibility of each witness. It was meticulous work, but necessary to uncover the full truth. Lucas felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This case was more than just a trial. It was a chance to restore justice and protect an innocent person from unfair punishment. As the day came to an end, Lucas requested a private meeting with Maya and her lawyer. They spoke quietly in his chambers, away from the public eye. Maya explained the pressures she had faced, how she had been manipulated, and how difficult it had been to navigate the complex financial instructions without knowing the larger scheme at play. Lucas listened carefully, taking in every word. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, see the honesty in her eyes, and understand the courage it took to face such adversity. He felt a deep respect for her, not just as a defendant, but as a person he had once called a friend. Lucas realized that the trial was about more than just evidence. It was about character, integrity, and the ability to endure under pressure. Maya's actions, her honesty, and her resilience demonstrated qualities that could not be measured by numbers alone. He understood that while the law required him to consider the facts, it also required him to see the human story behind those facts. He promised himself that he would continue to pursue the truth, no matter how difficult it might be, and ensure that justice was served. After the meeting, Lucas returned to his office, reviewing the day's evidence and notes. He thought about how easily someone like Maya could be misjudged based on appearances alone, and how important it was to look beyond the surface. The world could be harsh, and people could be quick to assume guilt without understanding the full story. Lucas felt a renewed sense of responsibility, knowing that his role as a judge allowed him to correct a potential injustice and protect someone from undeserved consequences. That evening, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Lucas reflected on the unfolding events. The case had taken an unexpected turn, revealing hidden truths and challenging assumptions. He thought about Maya, her courage and her unwavering integrity, and felt a mixture of pride and concern. He knew that the coming days would be critical, that more revelations could emerge, and that every decision he made would carry weight. Yet he also knew that he was on the right path, following a pursuit of truth that was guided not just by the law, but by a deep understanding of character and fairness. As he entered his apartment, Lucas allowed himself a moment to breathe, to collect his thoughts, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. The trial was far from over, but the direction it was taking gave him hope. Maya's innocence was beginning to shine through the shadows of deception, and the real story was starting to emerge. Lucas knew that there would be obstacles, resistance, and moments of doubt, but he was determined to see the case through to its rightful conclusion. He also understood that this journey was not just about the courtroom. It was about restoring faith, uncovering truth, and honoring the values he and Maya had both cherished since childhood. The day ended with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Lucas had taken important steps to uncover the hidden truths, and Maya had shown courage and resilience that inspired everyone who had witnessed it. The trial was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a story of human endurance, honesty, and the power of character. Lucas knew that the next steps would be critical, and he felt ready to face them, guided by both the law and his understanding of the person who sat across from him, the friend he had once known, and the innocent person he now knew she truly was. The morning of the fourth day of the trial brought a heavy tension into the courthouse. Judge Lucas had spent the night reviewing all the new evidence, thinking carefully about the next steps. He felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The case had already shifted dramatically, but there were still unanswered questions. He knew that the truth was beginning to emerge, but he also understood that uncovering it fully would require courage, honesty, and sometimes difficult conversations. After the courtroom had been called to order, Lucas allowed a brief pause before the session began. He wanted to make sure that both the prosecution and the defense were ready. Then, in a moment of careful discretion, he asked for a private meeting with Maya in his chambers. The staff quickly organized the room so they could speak without interruption. Lucas knew this meeting would be pivotal. It was not about legal arguments or documents. It was about understanding Maya, her choices, and her side of the story in a way that evidence alone could not show. Maya entered the room with her calm and composed demeanor. She greeted Lucas politely, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a quiet acknowledgement of the emotional weight of the trial. Lucas gestured for her to sit, and for a few moments neither spoke. The silence was filled with unspoken memories, the long years of friendship, the adventures they had shared as children, and the trust that had always existed between them. Lucas realized that this connection, this history, was giving him insight into her character, something that legal documents alone could not reveal. Finally, Lucas spoke. He asked Maya to tell her side of the story in her own words, without fear of judgment or interruption. Maya's voice was steady, though there was a quiet tremor of emotion beneath it. She described the pressures she had faced at the charity, how she had been given complex instructions without full understanding, and how she had realized too late that she had been used as a pawn in a larger scheme. She spoke of confusion, fear, and the frustration of being accused of something she had never intended to do. Her honesty was striking. Lucas could see that every word she said was sincere, and that her pain was real. As she spoke, Lucas felt a deep empathy for her situation. He remembered the qualities that had defined her as a child, her courage, her sense of fairness, her determination to do what was right. Those qualities had not disappeared. They were still there, guiding her actions and her responses. Lucas realized that the courtroom needed to see not just the documents and transactions, but also the person behind them. Maya's character, her integrity, and her resilience were just as important as any piece of evidence. They discussed the moments that had led to her involvement in the financial discrepancies. Maya explained how she had questioned certain instructions, sent emails expressing concern, and even sought advice from colleagues. All of these attempts had been ignored or overlooked, and in some cases her communications had been manipulated to make it appear as if she were complicit. Lucas listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. He could feel the sincerity in her voice and see the truth reflected in her expressions. It became increasingly clear that she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Lucas also asked about the emotional toll the trial had taken on her. Maya spoke quietly about the stress, the anxiety of being judged publicly, and the fear of losing her reputation and career. She admitted that it had been difficult to stay composed, but that she had tried to focus on honesty and truth, knowing that ultimately, that was what mattered most. Lucas felt a mixture of sorrow and admiration. He understood that facing such a situation required immense courage, and he was struck by her ability to maintain dignity and integrity under pressure. The conversation turned to the people who had been involved in the larger scheme. Maya identified individuals who had exerted pressure, manipulated information, and attempted to cover their own mistakes by blaming her. She described their tactics, the subtle ways they created confusion, and the moments when she had felt trapped and unsure of what to do. Lucas realized that these insights were invaluable. They explained not only why the financial irregularities had occurred, but also why the case had initially appeared to be her fault. He knew that presenting this context in court would be crucial to ensuring justice. Lucas felt a growing sense of responsibility. He was not only judging the facts but also witnessing a story of human struggle, resilience, and integrity. He knew that his role as a judge allowed him to consider the whole picture, including the human factors that often went unnoticed. He reassured Maya that the court would carefully review all evidence and that her honesty and courage would be recognized. Maya nodded, a mixture of relief and gratitude evident in her expression. It was clear that this private conversation had strengthened both of them, her trust in the judicial process and his determination to see justice served. After the meeting, Lucas returned to the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The session resumed, and he carefully guided the proceedings to include the context and information Maya had shared. He asked questions about specific transactions, the actions of superiors, and the emails and communications that had been manipulated. The defense presented this new information, and slowly, the courtroom began to see a different side of the story. Witnesses who had previously been ambiguous now clarified the truth, and the picture of Maya as a victim of manipulation became clearer. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. People who had been skeptical began to listen more attentively, recognizing that the case was not as straightforward as it had seemed. Even members of the public who had assumed Maya's guilt started to reconsider their opinions, as the evidence now aligned with the story she had shared with Lucas. The transformation was subtle, but powerful. Lucas could feel the tension easing, replaced by a sense of hope and anticipation. The truth was beginning to emerge, and the court was moving closer to justice. Throughout the day, Lucas remained attentive, careful to maintain fairness and impartiality. He knew that the legal process required balance, but he also understood that human stories, character, and integrity were critical to understanding the whole picture. He was determined to ensure that Maya's voice was heard, her honesty recognized, and the circumstances that had led to the accusations fully explained. This was not just about legal documents. It was about fairness, understanding, and acknowledging the human story behind the case. By the end of the day, Lucas felt a sense of accomplishment. He had taken important steps toward uncovering the truth, ensuring that Maya's perspective was fully represented. He had also gained a deeper understanding of the courage, honesty, and resilience required to navigate such a difficult situation. Maya had demonstrated that even in the face of adversity, a person could maintain integrity and dignity. Lucas knew that the coming days would be critical, but he felt confident that justice was beginning to be restored. As the courtroom emptied, Lucas stayed behind for a moment, reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the friendship he had shared with Maya, the trust that had formed in their childhood, and how that trust had guided him in understanding her character now. He realized that the bonds of the past could provide insight and clarity in the present, helping him see beyond the surface and uncover the truth. He also knew that the next steps would require careful judgment, continued attention to evidence, and a commitment to fairness above all else. Walking home through the quiet streets of the city, Lucas allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. The trial had revealed important truths, and Maya's honesty and courage had shown through. He thought about how easily people could be misjudged, how assumptions could lead to unfair conclusions, and how critical it was to look at the full story before making decisions. The experience had reinforced his belief in justice, integrity, and the importance of understanding human character. As he reached his apartment, Lucas paused to reflect on the day's lessons. He thought about Maya, the challenges she had faced, and the strength she had shown. He realized that this trial was not just about legal outcomes. It was about restoring faith in fairness, recognizing honesty, and valuing the resilience of individuals who face adversity. He felt determined to continue on this path, guided by both the law and his understanding of the human story at the heart of the case. That evening, Lucas reviewed his notes once more, preparing for the next day. He knew that the final stages of the trial would be crucial, and that every detail mattered. He also knew that the story of Maya, her courage and her integrity, would be central to the outcome. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal procedure. It was a stage for truth, understanding, and the recognition of character. Lucas felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that justice, guided by honesty and human insight, would ultimately prevail. The final day of the trial arrived with a quiet tension in the courthouse. Judge Lucas had spent the previous nights reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every detail of the case. He knew that this day would determine the fate of Maya, the person he had once known as a childhood friend, and now the defendant whose honesty and courage had slowly been revealed through the trial. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed the case, curious to see how it would end, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Lucas entered the courtroom with a steady, calm demeanor, but inside he felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. He had listened carefully to every argument, examined every document, and considered every testimony. The evidence had shifted dramatically over the past days. What had initially seemed like a clear-cut case against Maya was now understood to be a story of manipulation, miscommunication, and exploitation. The person sitting at the defense table was not a criminal, but a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The morning session began with Lucas asking the lawyers to summarize their arguments one last time. The prosecution presented their case, but it was noticeably weaker now. The inconsistencies, the overlooked emails, and the revelations from witnesses had created doubt about their version of events. Even the most confident members of the prosecution team seemed uneasy as they faced the carefully examined evidence. Lucas observed the room, noting the reactions of the jury, the spectators, and Maya herself. She remained calm, though a quiet tension lingered in her eyes, a reminder of the long days she had endured. The defense lawyer spoke next, highlighting the manipulations and pressures Maya had faced. They explained how key documents had been altered, how communications had been ignored, and how Maya had acted in good faith throughout her work. Witnesses were called to affirm these points, and Lucas listened intently, carefully considering every word. The story that emerged was one of integrity under pressure, honesty in the face of deception, and courage in the midst of uncertainty. Lucas could see that the courtroom was beginning to understand the real person behind the accusations. Lucas knew it was time to bring everything together. He asked questions that clarified the timeline of events, the responsibilities of those in charge, and Maya's actions in context. He was careful to be neutral, to present the facts clearly, and to ensure that the jury and public understood the full picture. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word, as the story unfolded with clarity and fairness. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The doubt that had been planted by the initial accusations was now replaced by recognition of the truth. As the session progressed, Lucas noticed subtle shifts in the audience. Some who had been skeptical were leaning forward, nodding as they understood the complexity of the situation. Others whispered quietly to one another, reassessing what they had believed. Even the jury appeared more engaged, their expressions showing careful consideration rather than assumption. Lucas felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The truth was being revealed, and justice was finally coming into view. At one point, Lucas addressed Maya directly, not as a childhood friend, but as a judge ensuring fairness. He acknowledged the courage she had shown, the honesty in her explanations, and the resilience she had demonstrated throughout the trial. He